Greetings, everybody. A couple of years back, I got the idea to go through the Bible slowly. Now, I did it in Mark 1, the first 29 verses to be exact. You could even say that this activity of going through the Bible slowly, verse by verse in Mark 1, is what largely motivated this whole endeavor of TTB, or through the Bible. Now, I must say, a lot of the notes that I took came from Mike Winger's New Mark series, but I don't know where his points ended and my own began. Thus, I heavily recommend checking out his series as well to confirm for yourself if a point you heard here and loved was from me or him. Credits due. Now let's talk about Mark 1. Verse 1 reads, "The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God." Now, Genesis began with the beginning of creation, of the universe, of everything. Mark begins with the beginning, but the beginning of the good news. Since the beginning, a lot has happened. The first beginning. Man has fallen, sin entered the world, and an impossible law has been instated. James 2:10 reads, "For whoever keeps the whole law, but fails in one point, has become guilty of all of it." Wait, did you know that there were believed to be 613 commandments originally given? Now, as a matter of fact, we could just look at the 10. As a matter of fact, we could just look at one. Thou shalt not lie. Have you ever lied before? Have you? If you said no, you're lying. Now, could you imagine a world where 612 additional laws hang over your neck like a guillotine, waiting for you to break them? And when you do, animal sacrifice or hell. You wouldn't want to forget a single day, yet we sin all the time. Should we be constantly doing animal sacrifice? You see, the old law couldn't save flawed man. The old law was practically impossible for man to fulfill. The old law would have resulted in you and me going to hell when it was all said and done. But then, can you say but then? The beginning of the good news. In that day, gospel was used by the Romans to reflect an important announcement. And I can't think of one more important than this one. It is an announcement which says you have a chance. A chance not in yourself, but a chance for salvation from something beyond you. But by this point, you might have read this first verse and now wonder, why doesn't this book begin with Mark said or Mark wrote? You see, historical texts don't actually write the name of the author. You can look at Greek philosophers such as Plato, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, or Varro. You see, anonymity was viewed as higher importance in writing, and nobody doubts those known philosophers because of consistent reference throughout history and time. It's the same context of the question, how do you know Abraham Lincoln lived if you never saw him directly? Because people talked about him and we have records throughout history, we have good reason to believe that that was a real person who existed. And similarly, we have good reason to believe that Mark wrote Mark. As Papias, who lived from 60 to 130 AD, a bishop of Hierapolis, he's one of our earliest sources. A quote from him reads, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that bless you peaches, dog, that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care, not to omit anything he heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements." End quote. You see other testimonies of Mark being the penman to Peter's teachings, whether it's Irenaeus, Clement of Alexander in 180 AD, or Tertullian in 200 AD, just to name a few. Now, it also makes sense because of how focused Peter seemed to be in the written accounts. And you'll see a lot more of that later. It almost seems as though of the 12, Peter is the main character, at least in the writings of Mark. But it would make a special sense for Peter to be one of the predominant characters of the 12 more so, because it's his knowledge. It's Mark writing what Peter tells him. It's Mark writing what Peter reminds him of. So Peter happening to remember things from his perspective, painting him in a higher, more leader-like light, makes sense. It also is just a character of Peter, but that'll probably be a minute before we actually get there. Another commonality that you will see are things specific to cultures of regions they were involved in. There will be Aramaic phrases translated into Greek, reflecting the region that Peter commonly preached in. We're looking at Palestine, Israel kind of area. Then you also have Latin translated words hinting towards a Roman audience, and it's commonly believed that Mark wrote this while being in Rome. And lastly is the lack of an alternative. You see, Mark is consistently attributed to be the writer. It wasn't even contested by anyone really until 400 AD. It was used by the early church alongside the other of the Gospels. Its genuinity was consistent, and it's fair to point out that all of the four Gospels are technically anonymous. There were Gospels that were not believed to be genuine throughout history, such as the Gospel of Judas, but this is not considered to be one of them. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the verse. You see, Jesus is the name. Messiah, Christos in Greek, is a title. It means anointed one, the one who is set apart, chosen by God. Not only is he set apart, but his unique relationship with God is made quite clear. The Son of God. 2 videos ago, we discussed how we are created, not begotten by God, similar to statues, not little gods. But Jesus is being described not as a mere creation of God, but as the same as God. Not a son, but the Son of God, begotten by God, early to say, but fully God and fully man. The title he holds and his divine relationship connects him to prophecies found in the Old Testament. Reading on to verse 2, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. This is found in Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 40:3. It's common for a writer to quote 2 passages simultaneously, but only to directly mention the most known one. Now, Isaiah is a major prophet, so it makes sense for Isaiah to be mentioned, even though Malachi is not. Also, the prophecy of Isaiah is directly connected in the latter half, but we see that more so in verse 3 than verse 2. But we see this as a verse which is not just prophesying Christ, but specifically the one before him, John the Baptist, directly translated to John the Baptizer. Now, when I see this, my mind wanders elsewhere in the Bible. It wanders to the different roles and points of a Christian in the process of evangelism. Now, I don't mean the person being evangelized. I mean the people doing the evangelism. Now, the Bible describes it as you have someone who plants a seed, you have someone who waters the seed, and you have the person who harvests it once it's grown, it's bloomed, it's ready. Now, what this describes is that out 2 of 3 of these stages in the process of salvation, you don't directly save the person. The process of salvation instead looks different at different points. It can look like selfless love, giving without any expectation of returning, even just a matter of regular service in your community, not directed towards the person, but they're seeing how you're treating people who you have no expectation of getting anything from. As a matter of fact, they're people who, even if they wanted to thank you, even if they wanted to do something for you, would not have the resources to do it. How do you treat waiters and waitresses? How do you engage with homeless people? What do you do to the people who can do nothing for you? And more importantly, what are you doing when you think nobody else is watching? It can be times like that where you're planting a seed in somebody's heart as they're seeing your actions and they're peeping you. They're observing you, and let's be honest, they're making judgments about you. It plants a seed. Now, perhaps the seed is watered by something that looks like answering questions, concerns, and slowly treating traumas instead of expecting an immediate conversion. One thing my homegirl had said is that whenever you treat people like projects, they feel it. When you treat people like projects instead of people, they feel it. When you just try and cram Christ down their throats, they feel it. And they become increasingly resistant and calloused to it because people are people first. Love first, teach second, love first, convert second. Conversion is an action of love, sure. Evangelism is an action of love, sure. But love takes different forms, and if you do not engage them all, you can lose them before you get the chance to give them the most important information. The thing is, in America, especially if you're in the South, odds are people have heard about Jesus before. There's a great chance that, as a matter of fact, they've been in a church before. They've sat in a Sunday service, and at some point they said, "This is not for me," or "Something else is." There's a great chance that they've engaged the faith, they've asked questions, they couldn't find the right answers, or they were treated so poorly and inhumanely that they went away from it. What does this mean? This means that that individual that you may be viewing as a project, an individual who just needs to hear the good news, has probably already heard the supposed good news, but they have problems. Problems either with past experiences, church hurt, or problems with the content itself, unresolved dilemmas and issues with informations, contradictions within the Bible. Now, am I saying they exist? I remain unreplied. My personal stance is the Bible is sufficient. I am not an individual who would argue for a perfect Bible. I would argue for a sufficient Bible. And I could go down my reasons as to why I wouldn't argue for a perfect Bible, but let's just leave it there for now. It's getting better and better as technology improves, and we can get closer and closer to what the original text likely was, or collection of text, mini library, but we're not there yet. And so I would 100% say it is sufficient for salvation and better connection and understanding of God, but not perfect, not perfect. Anyways, this is an individual who's likely wrestling with something, and you could help them out. But if you just assume that this is a blank canvas, that this is somebody who doesn't know God, doesn't know about God, odds are you'll miss the mark. I had a homeboy, and he used to do interviews, public interviews, and he would go up to individuals, he would ask them what their faith was, and oftentimes he would find people who used to be Christian, now agnostic. And he would ask them questions about how to get closer to God. Agnostic individuals, or individuals who weren't particularly strong about their faith. You know, they were culturally Christian, but they weren't really practicing. And he would just ask them, well, how do you get closer to God? How do you grow in your relationship with God? And their answers were usually on ball. The kind of answers that you would expect from a seasoned Christian, from somebody very vocal about their faith, maybe even from a pastor or youth leader. But these individuals weren't particularly active in their faith. They had the knowledge, but somewhere between submission to God and knowing about God, there was a disconnect. And that individual will never be reached by you merely walking up to them and telling them about the good news. I mention all of this to say that, similar to John the Baptist, we hold a responsibility to pave the way for Christ, figuratively. Each and every day with our lives and with our interactions with believers and non-believers alike. You see, every emotion is valid, but not every response to said emotions are. Every emotion is valid, but not every response to said emotion is. Individuals see you when you're angry. They see you when you're sad. They see you when you're jubilant. Individuals seem to always be watching. And whether at your highest or your lowest, individuals are looking at you and they're making decisions based upon your actions. And oftentimes, again, not even just for unbelievers, even unfortunately a common problem for believers is that people will look at what they see before them and say that the people who follow Jesus, model Jesus, that his followers reflect his heart, that our actions in the eyes of them reflect our Savior, and that in our weakness, it reflects a weak or an insufficient God. Now, I've mentioned this several times in the past, but it is just to say that the call to action in this video, very sternly and very simply, is to watch how you step in. It's a question of in what ways do you make a way for Jesus? In what ways do you plant seeds in the hearts of unbelievers or water said seeds, as the harvest is oftentimes perhaps the simplest part? The harvest is a heart that's already ready. It's a heart that perhaps is already seeking God and just looking for somebody to bring them along that final step. But most are not there. Most have no seeds planted, or they have a seed that is in dire need of watering. And that is where we, every believer, comes in on the day-to-day and is posed with that question. In what way do I make a way for Jesus on a day-by-day basis? We're going to keep this video brief. I appreciate y'all greatly. This should be a blast to go through Mark 1, to engage in the Gospels alongside the creation account. You get to see a split of narratives, and it doesn't become too perhaps monotonous in only discussing one topic for an extended period of time. Could be months, could be years, before finally making it to different major points in the Bible. The good news about Genesis is that you'll notice that after Genesis 2, the perspective seems to change drastically. Now, Genesis 1 is a pretty detailed creation account, and Genesis 2 seems to be a creation account largely from the perspective centered around man. But after Genesis 2, it's no longer about creation, but what creation begins to do. And as you begin to progress throughout the chapters, it's quite fascinating. So I do look forward to re-engaging Genesis, and going forward, it will likely be 3 books or 3 chapters of the Old Testament, 1 chapter of the New Testament. It's just that I knew especially Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 would likely be monotonous, as they're both creation accounts, just from different perspectives. But anyways, it is much love. Seek God. Stay in your word, stay in your prayer, and stay in your communities. I love you. Blessings.